Listen, they don't teach you this in history class, but on October 25th, 1944, a single American destroyer charged headfirst into the most powerful battleship fleet Japan had ever assembled and somehow lived long enough to make them turn around. No backup, no air support, just 7 torpedoes and a captain who'd rather die fighting than watch his friends get slaughtered. What happened next rewrote everything the Navy thought they knew about impossible odds. The USS Johnston wasn't supposed to survive the Battle of Samar, but Captain Ernest Evans didn't get the memo, and by the time the smoke cleared, the Japanese had retreated from a battle they'd already won. This is the story of how one man and his crew of 327 sailors turned a suicide mission into the most legendary naval engagement in American history, and why the Navy still studies this battle today when they want to teach officers what real leadership looks like under fire. October 25th, 1944, started like any other morning in the Philippine Sea. The sun was barely up, the water was calm, and the men aboard the USS Johnston were eating breakfast, drinking coffee, and probably complaining about the heat like sailors do. They were part of Taffy 3, a small escort carrier group protecting American landing operations at Leyte Gulf. Their job was simple: provide air support for ground troops, hunt submarines, and stay out of trouble. These weren't frontline warships. Escort carriers were basically cargo ships with flight decks welded on top, slow and lightly armed, nicknamed baby flat tops because they were smaller and weaker than real aircraft carriers. The destroyers escorting them, including the Johnston, were there to screen against submarines and maybe scare off the occasional enemy patrol boat. Nobody expected them to face a real threat. Nobody expected what was about to come over the horizon. At 6:45 in the morning, a lookout spotted something that made his blood run cold. Masts, lots of them, big ones, rising from the horizon like a forest of steel. Then the hulls came into view, massive, gray, bristling with guns. It was the Japanese Center Force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left in the Pacific. 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with 18-inch guns that could fire a shell the size of a Volkswagen over 25 miles. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, all of them bearing down on Taffy 3 at full speed. The Americans were outgunned, out-armored, and outnumbered by a factor that made survival seem like a joke. Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese fleet, couldn't believe his luck. He'd been hunting for the American carriers for days, and now here they were, practically defenseless, ripe for the taking. His orders were clear: destroy the American carriers supporting the invasion, break through to Leyte Gulf, and wipe out the transport ships landing troops on the beach. If he succeeded, the entire Philippine invasion would collapse. Thousands of American soldiers would be stranded. The war in the Pacific could drag on for years. Everything depended on whether Taffy 3 could hold the line. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, stared at the enemy fleet through his binoculars and realized he was looking at his own death. His 6 escort carriers couldn't outrun battleships. Their guns were too small to fight back. His destroyers were too light to absorb hits from 14-inch and 18-inch shells. He had one advantage: his carriers could launch planes, but they were loaded with anti-submarine weapons and bombs meant for ground targets, not armor-piercing torpedoes that could hurt a battleship. He did the only thing he could. He ordered the carriers to run south, making smoke to hide behind, and he told his destroyers to counterattack. not to delay the enemy, not to slow them down, to counterattack, to charge directly at a fleet 10 times their size and buy the carriers time to escape. It was a suicide order, and everyone knew it. Aboard the USS Johnston, Captain Ernest Evans heard the order and didn't hesitate. He'd been waiting his entire career for a moment like this. Evans was a Native American officer, half Cherokee and half Creek, and he'd grown up poor in Oklahoma during a time when the Navy didn't exactly welcome people who looked like him. He'd clawed his way up through the ranks on sheer grit and competence, and when he finally got command of the Johnston in 1943, he'd told his crew something they never forgot. He said, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to come along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Now, with the Japanese fleet closing in, Evans proved he meant every word. He grabbed the intercom and said, "A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." Then he ordered full speed ahead directly at the enemy. The Johnston had been hit by a kamikaze plane a few days earlier and wasn't even at full combat readiness, but Evans didn't care. He rang up flank speed, 35 knots, and pointed his bow at the closest Japanese heavy cruiser, the Kumano, which outweighed his ship by a factor of 5 and had guns that could blow the Johnston in half with a single salvo. The range was 18,000 yards, about 9 miles, and closing fast. The Japanese opened fire first. Shells the size of refrigerators screamed through the air, throwing up geysers of water around the Johnston as she zigzagged through the barrage. Evans ordered his guns to return fire, even though his 5-inch guns were like pea shooters compared to the enemy's 8-inch and 14-inch cannons. But he wasn't trying to sink them with gunfire. He was trying to get close, enough to launch his torpedoes. The Johnston carried 10 Mark 15 torpedoes, weapons that could actually hurt a cruiser or battleship if they hit, but they had a maximum range of about 10,000 yards, and Evans needed to get inside 9,000 to be sure. That meant charging straight into the teeth of the enemy fleet while shells rained down around him. His crew loaded the torpedoes, trained the tubes on the target, and waited for the range to close. The Japanese kept firing. Shells bracketed the Johnston, throwing water over her deck. One near miss shook the ship so hard men were knocked off their feet. Another shell hit the water 10 feet from the hull and exploded, shredding the plating and flooding a compartment. But Evans kept going. At 9,000 yards, he gave the order. "Fire torpedoes." 10 white streaks leapt from the Johnston's tubes and raced toward the Kumano at 45 knots. Evans didn't wait to see if they hit. He spun the ship around, laying down a smokescreen, and ran for cover. Behind him, the torpedoes closed the distance. The Kumano's captain saw them coming and tried to turn, but he was too slow. One torpedo slammed into her bow, blowing off the front 40 feet of the ship. The explosion killed dozens of sailors and flooded her forward compartments. She slewed to a stop, dead in the water, and fell out of the formation. One enemy cruiser down, but the Johnston wasn't done. As she raced back toward the American carriers, Evans saw another target, a column of Japanese battleships led by the Congo, a 30,000-ton monster with 14-inch guns. The battleships were closing in on the escort carriers, and if they got within range, it would be a massacre. Evans didn't have any torpedoes left, but he had his guns, and he had smoke, and he had one thing the Japanese didn't expect: the sheer audacity to pretend he was a bigger threat than he actually was. He ordered the Johnston to charge again. This time he sailed directly between the Japanese battleships and the American carriers, firing his 5-inch guns as fast as his crew could load them. The shells couldn't penetrate the battleship's armor, but they didn't have to. They just had to make the Japanese nervous. And it worked. The Japanese captains, seeing a destroyer charging at them with guns blazing, assumed there must be more American ships nearby, maybe cruisers or battleships hiding in the smoke. They slowed down. They turned away. They wasted precious minutes trying to figure out what was happening. And in those minutes, the American carriers got farther away. But the Johnston couldn't run forever. At 7:30 in the morning, 3 Japanese cruisers spotted her through the smoke and opened fire at close range. Shells slammed into the Johnston's hull, punching through her thin armor like paper. One hit knocked out her engine room, killing everyone inside and cutting her speed in half. Another hit destroyed her bridge, killing several officers and wounding Evans, who took shrapnel in his hand and face, but refused to leave his post. The ship was on fire, listing, bleeding oil, but she kept fighting. Evans moved to the aft steering station and kept giving orders. His guns kept firing. His crew kept loading. They hit one cruiser so many times that she turned away, her superstructure riddled with holes. They hit another cruiser and set her on fire. But the Johnston was dying. More shells hit her. Her gun mounts were destroyed one by one. Her decks were littered with bodies. Her engine room was flooded. She was down to one working gun, and that gun had almost no ammunition left. At 9 in the morning, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The men who could still walk threw life rafts into the water and jumped overboard. Evans stayed on the bridge. He was last seen standing near the aft steering station, his hand mangled, his face bloody, watching his men get off the ship. He went down with the Johnston when she sank at 9:45 a.m., 3 hours after the battle started. 186 men went down with her, including Evans. But here's the thing they don't tell you in the history books. The Johnston didn't die alone, and her sacrifice wasn't in vain. 2 other destroyers, the Hole and the Samuel B. Roberts, joined her in the charge, along with the destroyer escort Dennis. They attacked the Japanese fleet with the same reckless courage, firing every torpedo they had, shooting at battleships with guns that couldn't penetrate their armor, and making the Japanese think they were up against a much larger force. The Hole was sunk. The Samuel B. Roberts was sunk, but they bought time. The escort carriers, those slow, defenseless baby flat-tops, launched every plane they had. Pilots flew mission after mission, some without bombs, just strafing runs to make noise and keep the Japanese distracted. They dropped depth charges on battleships. They made fake attack runs to force the enemy to maneuver. One pilot, out of ammunition and out of bombs, flew so low over a Japanese cruiser that his wheels almost touched the deck, and the cruiser's captain flinched and turned away. And Admiral Kurita, watching all this chaos, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He called off the attack. His fleet was still intact. He still had overwhelming firepower. He could have pressed forward, finished off the carriers, and achieved his mission. But he was confused. He thought he was facing fleet carriers, not escort carriers. He thought there were American cruisers and battleships nearby. He'd been under air attack for 3 hours, and his nerves were shot, so he turned around and retreated. Taffy 3 survived. The invasion of Leyte continued. The Japanese never got another chance like this, and it all happened because one destroyer captain decided that running away wasn't an option. Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The citation said he fought his ship with such superb tactical skill and such indomitable determination that he materially contributed to the success of the vital mission of the task unit. But that's Navy talk. What really happened was simpler. Evans saw his friends about to die, and he decided he'd rather go down fighting than live with the shame of doing nothing. And because of that, hundreds of sailors lived. Thousands of soldiers on the beaches weren't slaughtered. The war in the Pacific stayed on track. The Johnston's wreck wasn't found until 2019, lying in 21,000 feet of water off the coast of the Philippines. When explorers finally located her, they found her hull shattered, her guns bent, her decks torn apart by shell fire. But they also found something else. Her bow was pointed toward the enemy, even in death, still facing the direction Ernest Evans had aimed her 75 years earlier. The Battle of Samar lasted 3 hours, but the lessons lasted forever. The Navy teaches this battle at Annapolis. Officers study Evans's tactics. Historians call it the most lopsided naval engagement in history, David versus Goliath, but with destroyers and battleships. And every time someone says that courage doesn't matter in modern war, that technology and firepower are all that count, someone brings up the Johnston. Because on that October morning in 1944, courage was the only thing that mattered. Let's talk about the details they don't put in the movies, the parts that make this story even more insane. When the Johnston charged the Japanese fleet, she wasn't just fighting battleships and cruisers, she was fighting physics. A destroyer is a small ship by naval standards, about 370 feet long, displacing 2,700 tons fully loaded. She's built for speed and agility, not for slugging it out with heavy warships. Her armor is thin, maybe half an inch on the hull, an inch on the gun turrets, just enough to stop machine gun bullets and shrapnel. A direct hit from an 8-inch shell would punch clean through her like tissue paper. A 14-inch shell from a battleship would vaporize anything it touched. The Johnston knew this. Her crew knew this, and they did it anyway. When Evans ordered the charge, he wasn't just gambling with his own life. He was asking 327 men to follow him into a fight they couldn't win. And they did it without hesitation. The engine room crew, working in 120-degree heat, pushed the boilers beyond their rated capacity, coaxing every ounce of speed out of the ship. The gun crews loaded and fired shells so fast the barrels glowed red. The torpedo crews armed the warheads, knowing that if a shell hit the torpedo tubes before they launched, the explosion would split the ship in half. And the damage control teams worked miracles. When the first shell hit and flooded a compartment, they sealed it off and kept the ship balanced. When fires broke out, they put them out. When the steering was knocked out, they rigged manual controls. When the power failed, they ran cables by hand. They kept that ship fighting long after she should have been a drifting wreck. But let's talk about the Japanese side for a second, because their perspective makes this even crazier. Admiral Kurita had been fighting for 3 days straight. His fleet had been bombed by American planes, ambushed by submarines, and hammered by air raids. He'd lost ships, including the super battleship Musashi, the Yamato's sister ship, which had taken 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally sinking. He was exhausted, paranoid, and convinced that the Americans had more ships in the area than they actually did. So when the Johnston came roaring out of the smoke, guns blazing, launching torpedoes, Kurita's first thought was, "This must be a trap." No destroyer captain would be crazy enough to charge a battleship fleet alone unless he had backup. There must be cruisers nearby, maybe battleships, maybe fleet carriers. The Americans must be trying to lure him into an ambush. Except there was no trap. There was no backup. There was just Evans and the Johnston, bluffing with everything they had, and the bluff worked. Kurita hesitated. He ordered his ships to maneuver defensively. He slowed down. And in a naval battle, hesitation is death. While he was trying to figure out what was happening, Taffy 3 was escaping. But here's where it gets even darker. After the Johnston sank, the survivors spent 2 days floating in the ocean. 141 men made it off the ship alive, clinging to life rafts and debris, surrounded by sharks. They had no food, no water, and no idea if anyone was coming to rescue them. Some men died of wounds, some died of exposure, some just gave up and slipped under the waves. On the second day, American ships finally found them and pulled 141 men out of the water. But Ernest Evans wasn't one of them. Nobody knows exactly how he died. Some survivors said they saw him on the bridge as the ship went down, refusing to leave. Others said he was so badly wounded that he couldn't have survived even if he'd made it into the water. The Navy officially lists him as killed in action, lost with his ship. But here's what we do know. When the rescue ships arrived, the survivors told stories about their captain. They said he'd been wounded early in the battle, but refused medical attention. They said he'd stayed on his feet for 3 hours, giving orders, encouraging his men, never showing fear, even when shells were ripping his ship apart around him. They said that when the order came to abandon ship, he personally made sure the life rafts were in the water before he'd even think about saving himself. And they said that when they last saw him, he was standing on the deck, saluting the flag as the Johnston went under. The Navy doesn't give out medals of honor lightly. Ernest Evans earned his not just for attacking the Japanese fleet, but for something deeper. He earned it for proving that leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about being willing to do the hardest thing when everyone is watching. It's about making a decision that might kill you and doing it anyway because it's the right call. It's about showing your crew that you won't ask them to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. And that kind of leadership is contagious. The other ships in Taffy 3 saw what the Johnston was doing and followed her lead. The Howell charged. The Samuel B. Roberts charged. The Dennis charged. Even the destroyer escorts, which were smaller and even more lightly armed than destroyers, joined the attack. They didn't do it because they thought they could win. They did it because the Johnston showed them it was possible to fight back, even when the odds were impossible. The Battle of Samar lasted less than 3 hours, but in that time, Taffy 3 sank 0 Japanese ships. Let me repeat that. They didn't sink a single enemy ship. The Kumano was damaged but made it back to port. The other cruisers and battleships all survived. By every conventional measure, the American forces lost the battle. They lost 3 ships sunk, dozens of planes destroyed, and over 1,000 men killed. The Japanese lost nothing, and yet the Americans won. Because winning isn't always about sinking ships. Sometimes it's about stopping the enemy from accomplishing their mission. And Kurita's mission was to destroy the American carriers and break through to Leyte Gulf. He failed. He turned around and retreated. The carriers escaped. The invasion continued. And the reason he failed wasn't because of superior American firepower or tactics. It was because a handful of destroyers convinced him he was facing a threat he couldn't handle. They made him blink. And in war, the side that blinks first loses. Now let's talk about what happened after the battle, because this is where the story gets really interesting. The survivors of the Johnston and the other sunken ships were picked up and sent back to Pearl Harbor. They were debriefed, given medals, and reassigned to other ships. But they couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Word spread through the fleet. Sailors who'd never met Ernest Evans started telling stories about him. Officers studied his tactics, trying to figure out how a destroyer had survived long enough to do so much damage. And slowly, the Battle of Samar went from being a footnote in the Philippine campaign to being one of the most famous naval engagements in history. In 1960, a Navy historian named Samuel Eliot Morison wrote about the battle and called it the most gallant naval action in American history. That's a bold claim. The Navy had been fighting since 1775. There had been battles against the British, the Spanish, the Germans, the Japanese. Famous captains like John Paul Jones and Stephen Decatur. Legendary engagements like the Battle of Midway and the Battle of the Atlantic, and yet Morison said Samar was the most gallant. Why? Because at Midway the Americans had the advantage. They'd broken the Japanese codes, they knew the enemy was coming, and they set a trap. At Samar, there was no advantage, just a handful of ships doing the impossible because they refused to quit. In 1982, the Navy commissioned a new destroyer and named her the USS Ernest E. Evans. She served for over 30 years before being decommissioned in 2015, but the name lives on. In 2020, the Navy announced they were naming another ship after Evans, a Flight III Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, one of the most advanced warships ever built. Because the Navy doesn't forget. When they teach leadership at Annapolis, they talk about Evans. When they train officers in surface warfare tactics, they study the Johnston's attack. When they want to explain what the phrase above and beyond the call of duty actually means, they show the battle footage from Samar. And here's the part that should make you stop and think. Ernest Evans didn't have drones or satellites or long-range missiles. He didn't have stealth technology or computer-guided weapons. He had a ship, a crew, and a choice. And he chose to fight. That choice saved lives. It changed the course of a battle. It inspired generations of sailors. And it proved something that a lot of people today don't want to believe, that individuals still matter, that one person in the right place at the right time, making the right decision, can change history. You don't need a big platform. You don't need a huge following. You don't need permission. You just need to see what needs to be done and do it. Evans saw that the carriers were about to be slaughtered, and he did something about it. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't form a committee. He didn't check with headquarters. He just pointed his ship at the enemy and opened fire. And because of that, the world remembers him. The wreck of the Johnston sits at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, deeper than the Titanic, crushed by the pressure of 4 miles of water. But her story isn't buried with her. It's in every Navy ship that sails today, It's in every officer who learns about the Battle of Samar. It's in every sailor who hears the name Ernest Evans and thinks, that's the kind of captain I want to be. And it's in the lesson that courage doesn't mean not being afraid. Courage means being terrified and doing it anyway. Evans knew he was going to die. His crew knew they were going to die. They did it anyway. That's not recklessness. That's not stupidity. That's knowing what matters and refusing to compromise. On October 25, 1944, the USS Johnston proved that one ship can make a difference. One captain can change the outcome of a battle. One crew can hold the line against impossible odds. And one decision, the decision to fight instead of run, can echo through history forever. If that doesn't make you rethink what's possible, nothing will. Hit subscribe to see what else they're not telling you about history.